All right, we'll get going here. Thanks everyone for coming to the webinar, the Weatherlogics webinar series, The Science of Hailstorms. I am Matt DeSorcy. I'll just be your host today. I'm the chief meteorologist at Weatherlogix and co-owner with Scott Kehler, who will be presenting today. And I'll also be joined by Murray Bantle, the CEO of Co-op Hail Insurance, who will be doing the first part of the presentation, and Scott will be doing the second part. So just a couple housekeeping items before we start here. Just like to remind everyone for the giveaway, you must be in attendance at the end to win. We'll be doing the draw at the end. And we're giving away 2 prizes. The first prize is a Weatherlogics subscription for the 2022 growing season. And the second prize is a Co-op Hail gift bag. And a few other notes here. The presentation will be recorded at this time, and we'll be able to view it later on YouTube. So anyone can go see the Weatherlogix YouTube channel and view it there. It'll be posted after this presentation. And if you are attending this talk for CCA credits, please post your name and ID in the chat, just so we make sure we give you those credits. And also, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to post in the chat. We'll be answering all the questions at the end of the presentations. And a few other notes here. We will be handing out or giving out polls, questions to the audience throughout the presentation. And these will just pop up on your screen or in the chat. And you can answer the questions as we go along here. So we'll get started here. The first presenter is Murray Bantle, as I mentioned. He has a successful track record of more than 30 years in the co-op hail insurance, the crop hail insurance industry. Murray has been the CEO of the Cooperative Hail Insurance Company since 2019 and has previously been the Chief Operating Officer since 2008. He has worked in various executive positions for Great American Insurance, Lombard Insurance, as well as being a partner in the startup and operation of Canadian Hail Agencies. As CEO, Murray works with industry regulators, agents, members, and his board of directors from across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. He also works with a network of international reinsurance representatives placing insurance risk into the reinsurance market. Murray has represented the industry in various capacities through his involvement with the Canadian Crop Hail Association. And Murray has a keen interest in the statistical side of the industry, as well as the science of hail and severe weather impact on growing crops. So I'll hand it over to you, Murray, and take it away from here.
Thanks, Matt, for introduction. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully you'll find our session informative. I'll give you a bit of an overview on co-op hail, the industry, the type of year that we had, and then Scott will provide what Weatherlogix does. I'm just going to put up our PowerPoint for you. All right, the science of hailstorms. So basically, I'm going to give you an overview, a little bit of the definition of hail. How did we do in 2021? Do hail alleys really exist, or the whole model of climate change? Crop hail insurance, what you might need to know. Crop vulnerability. What type of crop hail research is done? How do we train and educate our adjusters, and what service did Weatherlogix provide to co-op, and how did we get involved with them? So basically, what's hail? It's precipitation in the form of transparent or partially opaque balls or irregular bumps of concentric ice, and it does not include sleet, snow, and frozen or partially frozen rain. Hail forms in cumulus clouds when supercooled water droplets freeze on contact with condensation nuclei, such as dust or dirt. So an interesting fact is that severe thunderstorms capable of producing 1 inch or larger hail and winds that exceed 60 kilometers an hour. How did we do in 2021? The industry paid out just over $322 million this year with 12,000 claims. This is the second highest payout for the industry in history. 2008 was the highest for any of you that want to know. Producer premiums totaled just over 300 million, so that provided an industry loss ratio of about 104% for this year. So 2021 will be a balance sheet loss for most companies this year. Manitoba had some better results than Saskatchewan and Alberta did. Some quick industry facts. So prairie producers continue to insure their crops at record levels due to crop value and continued rising input costs. Did you know that industry rates have declined on average over 30% since 2010? So we are one of the lowest input costs and the only input cost that I would know that's gone down. Current rates are at or near historic lows, which is very positive for producers. And the CCHA reporting companies, or the Canadian Crop Hail Association, we provide an annual coverage of over $8 billion across the 3 Canadian prairie provinces. The split of those provinces, about 18% of that is in Alberta, 23 in Manitoba, and 58 in Saskatchewan. So of course, Saskatchewan with the largest land base has the most. Alberta's loss ratio for 2021 was 98%. Manitoba's was 26, so a successful year in Manitoba. And Saskatchewan's was 134. Do hail alleys really exist? You know, and how is our climate changing? So in this slide, what I've done is I've provided you, and this is Canadian hail, or sorry, this is co-op hails, and this is our Saskatchewan and Manitoba map of all-time loss costs. So if you look at an all-time loss cost on the first slide, it really shows you the where predominantly hail falls, and as you see, it's on the western side of the province. And if you go to pre-90 to the second slide shows you that it's different, of course, over the all-time history, but it definitely shows just sort of sporadic spots that were bad. And then when you got to the 1990s, you see that we have a large area across the southwest to just south of Regina and to the very southeast corner of the province of Saskatchewan that has hail. And then in Manitoba, you see that we have these spots that usually storms that come up from the south or from the US. In the 2000s, you see that again, it primarily was northwestern and the western dominated part of the province. And in the 2010s, you see that hail has lightened right off. So over the last 10 years, you can really tell that we have had a lighter session of hail. And of course, the industry has suffered less loss than through the previous decades that we've had. So from a company standpoint, you know, really when we look at it, is there hail alleys? There is places that do tend to get more hail. However, the one thing that we do see is that over time, whether, you know, in our case, we chose decades for this, but if you did it on a year-by-year basis and started to progress it forward, it would look very different over time. So the truth to hail alleys is, yes, there's areas that are more prone, but the real prone is actually historically in Canada. Alberta is the most hail prone province, and primarily due to its proximity to the Rocky Mountains. The icy and the dry currents from above the mountains mix with lower moist air, and it makes the perfect recipe for a storm. On average, as you move from west to east, there are patterns of decreased hail frequency and severity. Hail patterns continue to change over time. If you looked at our historic map, you see that in the 10-year blocks. One thing you can tell from our provincial loss cost in all time is that Manitoba tends to have a lower loss cost or lower losses to our liability. Saskatchewan's just a little bit higher. And then overall, you can see how it's changed in all time, the pre-90s to the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. And the reason that we have the pre-90s is we really don't have, as a company, great data to be able to actually show you the same way that we've been able to record it over the last 30 years. Again, if you look from east to west, you see how that loss cost goes. And if you look at on all time, if you look at the primary meridian around south of Manitoba, or what we call east of primary, it's the lowest. And then if you go to the west of primary, or Manitoba primarily, which is from Winnipeg all the way to the border, it's a little bit higher. And if you go to the west meridian in Saskatchewan and west of 2, you see that they're almost the same. And then west of 3, you see higher. And again, if you look at it over each of the decades, you can tell that it changes. And, if we come to the last 10 years, you can see that our data shows that it's significantly different and has been significantly more in the West. This year was a very interesting year for us. Again, different, which most years for us in the hail industry it is. In 2021, the active storm days were below our 5-year average. So if you look, the active storm days are the blue ones, and you can see that of 100% would be normal, we're below almost in all of them except August. And in the number of claims resulting from the storms, we were below average as well. And again, that's based on claim to policy ratio. We were somewhat below average from the 5-year average. And if you look at the cost per claim for 5-year average, it was almost double of normal. So this year was a very expensive year. There's a couple of things that could be resulted of. Of course, we had severe hail when we did have hail. And secondly, we also had, in some cases, crops that weren't as developed or poorer due to the drought and the dry. So those could be a couple of reasons. But this year was definitely a severe year for our industry. What do you need to know about crop hail insurance? Hail is the primary risk associated with farming on the prairies. It happens to some degree every year, and it's not predictable. I think I always use a line that if I could predict it, I'd probably have been a really wealthy guy a long time ago. So due to the rural nature of hail, little notoriety gets media attention unless it strikes a populous area, such as the late August storm in Regina this year, or the Calgary storm a couple years back in Alberta. And you hear very little about the impact on farmers' livelihood. We as an industry try to put information out to the media to advise them of the storms and what happens in the rural areas. Terry Lang made a comment this year from Climate Canada that the Regina storm, this type of storm, is unusual for how late in the year in August it was at the end of August, adding that it's been an all-round unusual year, and that most years June and July bring the severe storms, while August is marked as hot and dry. Actually, our statistics show that August is typically the second most active month in July, both in events and severity. So when we look at our statistics and go back, actually it's July and August. July, I think, has 80-some% days that have hail, and August has 78. So those are the two most active months. Hail insurance coverage has been around for well over 100 years. Cooperative Hail, we are just finished our 75th year in business, and we are a true cooperative, so we are owned by our producers. Our members receive dividends in our profitable years. So this gives you an idea of the historic daily frequency. So you can see that in May, typically there's very few storms. The beginning of June, and then probably from about June 15th on, it starts to pick up. And then July has about 81% of the days that have hail, and August is 78%. September drops back down to 48, and then October has about 5% of the days that have hail. So that gives you an idea from a cooperative hail standpoint where our data shows. What type of insurers are out there? Insurance companies versus managing general agencies versus government programs. The industry has 4 types of business models that are primary in our market. The government, such as MASC or Manitoba Crop, Alberta Crop, have hail products in the market. Primarily, they're not for profit, so their rating can often be less expensive, and as they have offsetting costs from their other crop insurance programs. Saskatchewan Municipal is a quasi-government entity. It's owned by the Association of Municipalities in Saskatchewan. They provide an at-cost coverage through a basic program which is legislated through its own provincial act. They also have additional and prairie hail options, which fall under the Provincial Insurance Act. So they are like us in the other private sectors. What they do is they use their own capital to provide underwriting risk. Cooperative Hail, we are the only cooperative or producer-owned and operated insurance company. We try to provide our hail at or near cost as a philosophy as well. And we're governed by the Provincial Insurance Act. So we use our company capital to provide any underwriting risk. Private insurers such as Palliser, Rain and Hail, they're licensed insurance companies held by private or public shareholders, and they're governed by the Provincial Insurance Act as well. And those companies use their capital to provide underwriting risk. And then last, we have the managing general agencies, companies like Canadian Hail or Ag Direct. They're privately owned hail insurance companies. They fall under the Provincial Insurance Act, and they require to have insurance company underwrite their business. They have no business retention, and they basically are paid through an underwriting commission arrangement. So ask yourself, if you're a producer, are you worried about severe weather? Are you protected? Do you cringe when you see those dark clouds coming? Has your crop emerged? If you answered yes to any of those questions, you should probably make sure you have hail insurance coverage. Unlike a homeowner, you have options to protect roofs, siding with products manufactured to withstand some levels of hail, or as they've done in Calgary, car dealerships use lot covers. Farmers have no defense insurance coverage. It would take a really large cover for you to probably cover your land up. When does hail coverage come into effect? Hail coverage does not come into effect until noon the day following the purchase. So you can't buy your hail insurance when you see those big clouds building up. You should probably buy. And one thing we always tell our insurers is, why do you wait? I mean, you're waiting probably for emergence, but it costs the same in June as it does in July. The other thing you should know is that there are companies who don't accept risk after a crop's been damaged. So early hail, which is becoming more prevalent in the last number of years, can be a risk. And what does hail policy cover? Well, hail covers spot loss or damage to specific acres, leaving others relatively unharmed. So it's a stated value insurance. Hail insurance covers direct damage due to hail. It does not cover directly or indirectly disease, heat, wind, rain, and insect. Those perils are not covered by a hail insurance policy. Your policy will state that it is direct damage due to hail. We also provide fire endorsement for loss on field crop only. Spot loss hail coverage basically provides an opportunity loss where profit exists outside of your multi-peril coverage. And again, we probably, being hail, are one of your highest risks. How can I purchase my hail insurance? Well, you can purchase it through your local agent in your town, or now there's also the emergence of the direct-to-consumer products via the internet. Most companies now have both option types available. Direct-to-consumer products tend to have a cost saving associated to the product having no agent costs. And then you might wonder how your rates are determined. Well, rates are typically determined by historic losses paid over time, or what we refer to as a loss cost, losses over liabilities. However, competition plays a key role in the crop surcharges and in the rates. Trying to gain market share in a mature market. Hail is a mature market. We have had a recent entry with the direct market the last few years, but basically the market doesn't change a whole bunch. It's the same acres year over year. Crop vulnerability. All crops, we get questions a lot about how crops react to hail, and they all react differently at different periods and at growing cycles. Research shows that early crop damage in many cases recover extremely well with minimal damage. But of course, that depends a lot on the weather conditions that follow the storm. That can play a factor in that recovery. In cases where we come out early on an early storm and there may be recoveries in doubt, or adjuster can't determine what's going to happen with that crop, the final adjustment we may ask to defer it until it reaches production stage. Frost, there's often concern that an early hailstorm may cause delay in maturity or setback, thus cause the hailed crop to subject to early frost. Frost is not an insurable peril under the crop hail policy. This is often something we get internally in the office, and frost is not covered. Again, you know, the delay in the maturity is something some companies look at, but frost is not a covered factor. Loss factors or crops damaged by hail may be subject to loss factors. You may have had adjusters out who will chart a crop, and we will use those to calculate the loss. All the factors are applied in accordance with the NCIS loss adjusting procedures. Those procedures are what we use to do our losses. So crops are vulnerable to hail from emergence through harvest. And I did up a slide here on a weekly basis through our 09 through 20 with just 4 crops: canola, lentils, peas, and wheat being the baseline. You can kind of see how all the other crops react to hailstorms in those periods of time over a 10 or 12-year period. So just to give you an idea that, of course, July storms affect, you know, where hail's a baseline. Of course, sometimes the lentil and the peas can be affected a little more, usually during flowering, those types of things. And then, of course, at the end of the year, as crops are ripe, you can see that many of those numbers go up. Why are crops surcharged? You know, so why do you pay more for peas? And so basically, they're surcharged on the basis of historical losses. Something like peas is typically about 2 times the cost of wheat, so that's why we surcharge it at 2 times. You can see a crop loss comparison here where peas is the highest. I've done it on a 30 down to a 5-year basis to kind of show you some of the change over time. And some of that change, you know, why has canola decreased to a base rate? Well, statistics have shown it that the evolution and the genetics of canola since the rapeseed plant have, you know, probably caused the loss cost to come down. The crops have great recoverability and early claims. And so thus that surcharge has come down over time. Some companies have moved to pricing canola as a crop unto itself. So you have a wheat price and you have a canola price. What type of research do we do? Well, the Canadian Crop Hail Association have a licensing agreement with NCIS out of Kansas City. And basically, they're a company who plan and implement and collect research data in coordination with the agricultural universities and colleges throughout the US. And in Canada, we use our own University of Saskatchewan to study the effects of hail on crops. So they basically do a hail effect type of research on different crops. And we have done recent research on things like peas and canola, and I believe lentils is currently being done. From this data, NCIS creates loss adjusting procedures for the crop hail adjusters. And the research and adjusting practices are approved by our regulatory body for the use by the CCHA. So our provincial governments approve that here in Saskatchewan. How are our adjusters educated or licensed? In Saskatchewan, our crop hail adjusters are licensed by the Insurance Council of Saskatchewan, who are regulated through the provincial government and the Superintendent of Insurance. They all work with the Saskatchewan Financial Consumer Affairs Authority. Those regulatory bodies are also in each of our other provinces, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, or sorry, Alberta and Manitoba. Adjuster training and knowledge. As a company, Cooperative Hail, we pride ourselves in providing in-field training throughout the summer to expose our adjusters to varying conditions, crop staging, and crop management. Saskatchewan has yearly requirements that an adjuster has to maintain that license, as well as they have to provide CE hours to maintain that license over, I believe, over 2 years. So how did we get involved with Weatherlogix, and what service do they provide to us? So this year we worked with Scott and his team. They provided us with a daily hail mesh or storm activity with potential hail diameter. And so they provided us with maps every day of where there was activity that potentially could have had hail. Ultimately, they gave us even more, a severity map that we use. And this gives you an idea that if we went back the to the one before, it showed you the mesh in just a quick diameter. This is actually the hailstorms from the date of July 11th this year. So it shows you how it went right across Saskatchewan. I believe Regina is right in here. So we had a big sweep across the north and one across the south. And likewise, then in the office, we're able to take that data and go one more step and overlay it with our claims. So these are all the claims that we had for that storm that we overlay in there. And so it'll give us an idea on the data that Weatherlogix provides us. It'll tell us what they think the potential size of that hail might have been in those different areas. That's what all the colors represent. So that's basically what they provided us with. And that's the end of my part. Matt?
Okay, great. Thanks, Murray, there. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to post in the chat. I saw there was 1 or 2 questions that came up, so we'll be answering those right after Scott's presentation. And I'll just hand it over to Scott here. I'll quickly go over his biography so everyone knows who Scott is. But Scott is the president and chief scientist at Weatherlogix here. He attended the University of Manitoba, where he completed both his bachelor's and master's degrees in meteorology. In his current role as chief scientist at Weatherlogix, Scott conducts weather research and develops tools to help clients, such as the hail mesh map you just saw, for all types of weather conditions. This includes new methods to improve weather prediction and the analysis of past weather events. Despite his research focus, Scott still enjoys forecasting day-to-day weather and is often involved with preparing forecasts for high-impact events. So that's all for me. I'll hand it over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Matt. I'll put up my slides here, and if there's any problem, just let me know.
Yeah, I can see your screen there, Scott.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in my presentation today, I'll be talking about 3 main things, being how hailstorms work, the 2021 hail season from a weather perspective, and some of the work that we do in hailstorm monitoring in terms of tracking these storms and also trying to forecast them. But firstly, how do hailstorms work? Well, we've got a quiz question to start out here. So I put up 3 pictures, and what I'm asking you is which one of these is showing hail. So I think Matt will be able to post that question in the chat, and you should be able to answer it. So I'll give a moment for that. And as you're looking at these pictures, keep in mind the definition that Murray gave earlier. Oh, Matt, I'm not able to see the question with my slide up, so if you close the poll here in a couple of seconds, maybe you could just read the results for everyone.
Okay, will do. I'll give it another 20 seconds for people to get their responses in. Seeing a couple people commenting in the chat too. They're thinking D or C. 5 seconds. All right, closing the poll here. 38% C and 62% all of the above, and 0% for A and B.
Okay, interesting. So I'll go through them one by one. A is actually what we call ice pellets, and the reason that we know that is because of how small they are. This is a penny, and the particles are very tiny. Hail, by definition, has to be at least 5 millimeters in diameter. So these are not quite big enough. These types of particles you would typically see during a winter storm. You might see freezing rain at the same time, or these little guys. So these are actually refrozen raindrops and not hail. B is what's called graupel or snow pellets. So they look like tiny balls of snow. And again, those are usually things you would see more in winter or with temperatures close to the freezing mark. C is the actual hailstone, so they're larger pieces of ice, more than 5 millimeters in diameter. So the correct answer is C. Thanks everyone for voting, and as we go through, I'll talk a little bit more about how these particles develop. So where does hail come from? Well, you probably know that hail typically is associated with thunderstorms, and I think it's pretty fair to say that really hail only comes from thunderstorms. You might not actually happen to hear thunder when it happens, but the storm itself would be defined as a thunderstorm. And these storms have rapidly rising warm and humid air. So typically you'll see them in the summer, but you can also see them in shoulder seasons too. So that warm and humid air tends to be most common from June through August. But as you can see in my slide here, hail has actually been reported in Canada all the way from March through October. But of course, June through August is the peak of that activity, with July being by far the month with the most hail reports. Here's an animation of a thunderstorm. And in this picture, what you're seeing is that warm and humid air rising up into the atmosphere and developing into a thunderstorm cloud called a cumulonimbus cloud. And this is a time lapse, so it's kind of sped up. But if you're out on a warm summer day and see a cloud like this, they actually grow quickly enough that you can really observe them in real time. So what's happening is that warm air is rising up into the cloud like this, forming this core here of that updraft. And as the warm and humid air rises high enough, eventually it can't rise any higher because what it's hitting is the bottom of the stratosphere. And at that point, it spreads out in both directions and forms that kind of overhanging anvil cloud, which you see here and a little bit here as well. So the hail is being developed because this updraft is very strong vertical wind, and it's able to keep those ice particles up in the cloud long enough for them to grow to a relatively large size. Here's a picture from a satellite showing thunderstorm development. This is along the lee of the Rockies in the US, but a similar thing happens quite commonly in Alberta during the afternoon, where you'll see in the morning skies are clear, but by the afternoon a lot of clouds are coming off of the foothills of the mountains and then move out onto the plains. So places like Calgary, which are just in the lee of the Rockies, will oftentimes have this happen where these thunderstorms develop in the afternoon, then move over the city and oftentimes progress even farther to the east from there. This animation on satellite is only 4 hours, so you can see how it goes along the lee of the Rockies here from almost clear skies earlier in the animation to a fairly large clouds toward the end. And this is a 4-hour loop, but sometimes this process can happen even faster. It's known to happen even within an hour sometimes. And the locations where these storms developed is somewhat random. We know roughly where they're going to form because they need to have that warm and humid air in place for their development. And also we know that they tend to like to form along the lee of the Rockies in places like Alberta. In other parts of Canada where there aren't pronounced mountains, they can form in other locations too, especially along fronts like cold fronts. But exactly where they're going to form, so along which hill or in the lee of which mountain, is going to be something that is kind of random. We don't know in advance really exactly where a particular storm will form. We know the broad area, but we don't know the precise location. And that's why in the weather forecast, they talk about a risk of thunderstorms or a probability, because we can handicap the probability based on the conditions, but we don't know the exact formation area until those clouds really start to develop. So here's a picture showing a thunderstorm and kind of how it works. So in this one, the picture is showing the warm, humid air rising up into this updraft. At the top, it spreads out into that anvil cloud. And sometimes there's this little bump on the top. That's what's called the overshooting top, and that kind of tells you where the core of the updraft is, because the air rises up extremely fast, and then it will actually overshoot the anvil. So it'll punch a little bit into the stratosphere, but it won't make its way very far, and then it will settle back down into these anvil clouds at the top. And within the updraft is where the hail tends to be suspended. So the hail is carried by the updraft. It moves around within the storm a little bit chaotically. And when it's in a specific part of the storm where the temperatures are just right, the hailstones are able to grow as water is deposited on them. So I think Murray mentioned that hailstorms or hailstones form initially with a small particle, and that small particle is called the embryo. Embryos can be things like frozen droplets or even those Wrapup particles I showed on the first slide. From there, those particles or embryo have water deposited on the outside and slowly grow into large stones, or in some cases quickly grow into large stones. The stronger the updraft of the storm, the larger the stones can grow because they're able to remain in the cloud for longer. And as a rough rule, the hotter and more humid it is, the stronger the updrafts could be, because when it's really humid, that tends to result in very buoyant air, which can accelerate upward more rapidly. So when the hail is growing in the cloud, there's two primary mechanisms that growth occurs with. One of them is called wet growth, and the other is dry growth. Wet growth is a process where water is deposited onto a stone, but freezes very slowly. And because of that, the air that was in the water droplets can escape, allowing the water to freeze onto the stone in a clear layer of ice, which is shown here. So a wet growth stone tends to be fairly clear and hard. A dry growth hailstone is one where water is deposited onto the stone and freezes instantly, which causes the air to be trapped in those water droplets when they form ice. And as a result, you get a whiter looking stone that's a little bit lighter and softer because there's a lot more air trapped in those stones. However, quite commonly, you'll actually see a combination of the two. So here you see two stones where they initially were dry growth. So you see in the middle they're white, and then a layer of wet growth occurred over top, which is clear. And oftentimes you'll get this process happening multiple times, and then you can kind of see if you were to cut a stone in half, different layers, kind of like an onion, where different types of growth were occurring. There's also aggregate stones, which is a method where hailstones grow by merging. So these stones you can see look like a bunch of smaller ones all merge together into a larger one. So aggregate stones are another way you can get large hail. And different types of thunderstorms are more prone to produce hail than others. This is a radar animation showing a lot of storms. This is from kind of the southeastern US. And anywhere that's kind of red, purple, orange, those are all thunderstorms. The green is more just rain. But you can see that as the loop goes on, the storms are moving in different directions. Initially, you see some here out ahead of this line. These storms here initially are moving kind of to the northeast. The main line of storms is kind of moving west to east. And then there's some little embedded ones, those little pink spots you see, they're actually kind of diving from the northwest to the southeast. And all these different storm motions tell us a little bit about what type of storms they are. The ones especially that are really intense and moving differently than the rest, so there's a pink spot here and another pink spot down there, those ones that are diving more toward the southeast are called supercell storms. And supercell storms are unique in that they have a rotating updraft. So not only are they very strong storms, but because of the rotation, they also will often have tornado potential. But because of that rotating updraft, the storm has unique attributes which allow it to have a stronger updraft than similar storms in the same area. So if you look at this map of storms, those supercells with the pink spot in them will tend to produce larger hail than other storms that are just right next door to it. So we watch carefully for these supercells because they will tend to produce larger hail than other storms, even that are happening at the same time. So if you do see an event where you get really large hail, like baseball size hail, very good chance it came from a supercell storm. So now moving on to the 2021 hail season as we saw it from a weather point of view. Overall, it was a less active year for severe weather on the prairies. One really striking statistic is that there were no tornadoes reported between mid-June and mid-August this summer. That's never happened before on the prairies. We almost always get tornadoes at that time of summer. But there's a group called the Northern Tornadoes Project, which closely tracks tornadoes in Canada, and they reported none in that time period, which is very unusual and kind of a proxy indicator as to the lack of severe weather compared to normal. Hail reports were also down overall in our tracking, but that doesn't mean that there weren't significant storms. Even in inactive years, and this year in many parts of the prairies was a drought year, you still get hail. Hail happens every year, and even large hail happens every year, but it doesn't necessarily impact people. It depends on where the storms track. So there are a few big events. Calgary got hit by a fairly significant storm on July 2nd. Here's our hail map from that, showing storms hitting the Calgary area with hail up to, I think it was up to golf ball size. Eastern Saskatchewan on July 22nd, there were a number of tracks with very large hail. I think some of these tracks hit up to baseball size. August 23rd, again in Saskatchewan, I think Murray might have showed this one or the next one, track of hail going through a place like Moose Jaw near Regina. And another one in Saskatchewan on the 31st of August, hitting Moose Jaw and Regina again with significant hail. So even though overall it was a less active year, there were still a number of significant storms. So another poll question for you. Which province over the last 4 years averaged the most hail reports? So Matt, I'll let you quickly show that again, and then we'll reveal the answer.
Give it another 15 seconds for the answers to come in here. Seeing lots of A's, a few B's. All right, closing the poll. Looks like 70% voted for Alberta, 30% Saskatchewan, and 0% Manitoba.
No love for Manitoba and hail. But the majority is correct. Alberta did average the most hail by a fairly significant margin over the last 4 years. I think Murray mentioned as well, he gave you a hint saying that Alberta was the most hail-prone province for those of you that were paying close attention. So really over the last 4 years, Alberta has had the most hail reports every year. This includes all types of hail, regardless of size. And Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they vary. Some years Manitoba is a bit ahead, but I would say probably if you were to look at a longer term average, Saskatchewan would probably come out on top by a little margin. Although Manitoba, as I'll show here, in terms of severe hail reports, Manitoba actually does get quite a few severe events compared to the other provinces. So if you look back at 2018, Alberta and Manitoba were quite similar in terms of severe hail. But again, on average, Alberta would tend to rank higher for severe hail. And then Saskatchewan and Manitoba are more variable. They both do get quite a few severe events over the years, but typically a lower average than Alberta would get. Here's a map of all actual hail events in our database from 2021. So the red squares, or there are other colors too, green, red, whatever color square, are townships, so 6 mile by 6 mile area. And the color coding indicates how many sections within that township were affected by hail. The data you're seeing here includes our database of hail reports and co-op hail claims. So Manitoba and Saskatchewan kind of look like they have more than Alberta, but that's because co-op hail only has data in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So Alberta is strictly using our database, but if we're looking to expand with other hail insurance providers to get more coverage for all the provinces. But overall, you see that Saskatchewan had pretty broad impacts from hail, Manitoba less so, and then Alberta, it doesn't look like it did, but as I showed from the number of reports, it had quite a few significant storms as well. And you're seeing a lot of those squares around Edmonton and Calgary, which were both hit, and Calgary more so than Edmonton. So how did the data this year compare to previous years? Well, the real answer is we don't really know, because in climatology, you typically want about 30 years of data to draw trend lines. And our database of hail, as I'll discuss in a moment, doesn't go back 30 years with high quality data. There is older data, but a lot of the older data, especially prior to the social media era, is of poor quality. And social media has resulted in a large increase in reports, not because there have been more storms, but because more people are posting about them. So it's very hard to draw trend lines for hail. And Murray, I think, has kind of alluded to the fact, too, that there's a lot of variability as well, decade to decade. So it's a tough thing to draw trends on. What we do know is significant hailstorms are happening, and they continue to happen every year. So our hail database, which I showed some information on earlier, has reports of hail from all of Canada. And these reports include things like hail diameter, location, and time. And the reason we track hail measurements as reports like this is because it's really the only way to know for sure what's happening. You can infer hail size from weather radar, which we've shown on some of those mesh maps, but those maps are from algorithms. They're not direct measurements of hail. Weather radar does not directly measure hail, so we need to have these real reports in order to ensure that our maps are correct. And in our database, we follow strict quality control. There's 3 levels. A level 0 report is a report that's imprecise and we could not record. So an example would be large hail occurred in Edmonton on July 25th. That tells us that hail happened, but there's no information about diameter or location or time. So we simply don't consider that to be a valid report. And then the more detail you get, the higher the quality control level. So 1 is a report that's reliable but imprecise, and a level 2 is one that's highly precise. So somebody's actually taken a ruler and measured it. Hail report maps, I showed this earlier, but we keep a real track of actual reports and what's happening. And this is very valuable for ensuring that our information about hail is valid and correct. Since 2017, our database has over 6,000 high-quality reports. Every single one has a quality control level to it, so we know the precision of it, location, diameter, and so on. And you can see across Canada, there's a lot of reports on the prairies and a lot in Southern Ontario and Quebec. But there is a population bias, as I've highlighted here. Edmonton and Calgary, you see your hot spots, not because they get more storms, simply because there's more people reporting on these events. There's also hail swath maps, as I showed earlier. These are derived from weather radar, but you always have to bear in mind weather radar does not measure hail directly. It infers it using algorithms. So we use our actual hail reports to calibrate these maps and ensure that they are actually correct. Now, for our agriculture clients, we talk a lot about severe weather in our discussions. We send out forecasts to them every day discussing the potential for severe weather, including hail. And when hailstorms are happening, we send out updates, letting people know where these storms are and what their severity is. So if you're in agriculture, make sure to stay tuned till the end for the giveaway, as we'll be giving away a subscription to that service. Some of the future advances we're looking to do are incorporating more insurance data to get a full picture of hail events. So for insurance companies who might be listening, if you're interested in partnering, we take data from companies. It's anonymous, so when we share maps like the one I showed, we don't indicate any detail about who it came from or anything like that. But we're looking to incorporate more data to get a fuller picture of these events. We're also improving our radar algorithms, encouraging citizens to document these events, and also improving forecasting of hailstorms. So here's a couple examples of forecast maps. We produced these maps ahead of 2 major events this year, one on July 22nd in Saskatchewan, which was a major event that I showed a map for earlier, and also one at the end of August, also a major event. So here we've highlighted in orange the areas most prone to hail risk, and we made these maps in advance. So our meteorologists identified where these storms were expected, and as you can see with the yellow star, our maps showed those highest risk areas and captured these events. Now, you might be thinking, well, those are pretty broad areas and the storm was only in a small part of it. Well, there were actually hail in many other parts of our highlighted areas. I'm just showing the major events as stars. So that's my talk for today. Looking forward to answering your questions about all of this in a moment. Thanks for listening, and I'll turn it back to Matt.
Okay, thanks, Scott. I see there's a few questions in the chat, so I'll just list off a couple for you or Murray to answer here. The first one was from Paul. I wonder how the hail forecast might shift over the next several years due to climate change.
Well, from
Scott,
my
I'll leave that to you.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say from my perspective, it's again something we don't know. And the reason is, for one, like I showed, we don't have good data to analyze the trends, so we don't really know what's going on right now in terms of hail trends. The other thing is there's been a lot of research done on this around how will severe weather change with climate change. There's two competing views. One is that it will increase because there'll be more hot and humid weather as temperatures rise. The other view is that with warmer temperatures, thunderstorms may be inhibited because thunderstorms require hot, humid air at the surface and colder air aloft. But if you warm that air aloft, it actually reduces the updraft speed and perhaps could result in weaker or no storms. So there's still a lot of ongoing research on this, and it's far from decided how those trends will evolve going forward. But that's why we're doing the research and collecting these reports so that we can now create a very accurate database and begin to analyze the trends going forward. So we're working on trying to study the trends, and hopefully in the coming years we'll have a better feel for what's going to happen.
Yeah, I can say from our part, Scott, that we don't have a lot of trend information either, but we can tell that the warmer storm weather is moving somewhat more northerly. Like when we look at hail tracks over historic to now, we see stuff a little bit further north on the west side of the province. That storm activity and severity is moving a little bit north, but that's really in a decade. So, again, when you're looking at weather, a decade's nothing, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. And a point about northern areas too, when I showed my map of hail reports, you notice that there weren't many reports in the northern prairies or northern Ontario. And that's not because there's no storms there. We know there are lots of storms there. There's simply not enough people reporting on those storms. And there's also no weather radar there to track the storms. So we need better data in those areas to understand to what extent maybe the storms are moving north or not. We just don't have the data yet to tell.
Okay, thanks, guys. And I see there's a hand lifted. Just make sure to, if you have a question, feel free to post in the chat, and that's where we're answering the questions. So thanks for the interest. The next question here from Kayla, does the speed of the storm formation affect the hail size?
Yes and no. I guess it really depends on the circumstances. So the speed of a storm is governed partly by what's called wind shear, which is the winds at the upper parts of the atmosphere. And typically when you have strong winds in the upper part of the atmosphere, that is favorable for hailstorms. And that can also cause the storms to move more quickly. But it's not always the case. I won't get into all the details, but I would say as a rough rule, a fast-moving storm probably would have more hail potential because there is more wind shear. But there are caveats. I won't go into them because we'll try to keep this brief.
Okay, and the second one from Kayla here, likely for Scott. Would a dry and wet growth hailstone of the same size cause the same amount of damage?
Well, in theory, if they were both the same size and one was entirely wet growth and the other was entirely dry growth, the dry growth one should be lighter in weight and possibly a bit softer, so it should cause less damage. But in practice, other factors like how strong are the winds at the time will also determine how much damage there will be. So there's no perfect rule, but roughly speaking, a entirely wet growth stone of the same size should be harder and cause more damage.
Okay, thanks. And a couple more questions here. I see Francis. I assume you get your hail tracks derived from radar. Do you also do hail tracks for area of Canada that don't have radar, such as the northern prairies? If not, or if so, what tools do you use?
Well, if there's no weather radar, there's currently no algorithm to produce the types of hail maps I showed. However, there is research being done, especially using satellite, to track overshooting tops. And you'll remember that graphic I showed where the storm had that overshooting top that punched above the stratosphere a little bit. With satellite, you can kind of identify where those tops are, and those tops are correlated with hailstorms. So we can kind of look at that to see where these storms are, but it's definitely not as accurate or precise as using radar. So currently, there's not a great way to do it, but we can use tools like satellite and also lightning data to try to see where these storms are tracking at least.
Okay, thanks, Scott. There's two more here I see. Jeremy, can these hailstorms and their severity be predicted in advance? So I think you alluded to that, Scott, the forecast, but maybe you can go into how specific we can get the predictions.
So as I mentioned, what we do at our office is we draw those forecast maps that I showed, and they outline areas that are favorable for hailstorms based on where the warm and humid air is located and where fronts are that might trigger the storms. But as I also mentioned, we don't know precisely where a storm will form until it begins to develop. We know the broad area, we don't know the precise location, and the precise location where a storm will form and where it will track is still beyond our knowledge of meteorology to predict. It's something that we're slowly getting better at, but it's still not entirely possible to do. The only time you know kind of for sure a storm will happen is if there's a really long line of storms that's moving through an area. But even with that, you don't know for sure what parts will produce hail. So in general, we know broadly where the hail is possible, but we won't know for sure where it's happening until the storm develops.
Okay, thanks. And a question from Ahmad. How do we determine thunderstorms with hail? How do we determine thunderstorms with hail from thunderstorms with hail and tornadoes using radar? And what other resources can you use apart from radar? So
well, maybe what I'll quickly talk about
Yeah.
identifying on radar, and maybe Murray, you could mention how you're using the radar data to correlate with your claims. So for us anyway, to derive where hail is happening from radar, we use an algorithm called MESH, which is predicting the maximum hail size. So that takes radar data, a variety of measurements from the radar, runs it through an algorithm, and then predicts what the hail size will be. For tornadoes, we use a different part of the weather radar called velocity, which measures the winds within a storm. And if those winds show a part of the storm that's rotating, that's an area of the storm we would be watching for tornado development. Again, like hail, it doesn't directly tell us for sure if a tornado is happening, but it gives us a strong signal that a tornado is possible in part of the storm, and then we can investigate from there.
Yeah, and for us, I mean, primarily we used Weatherlogix and Scott and his team's data. Firstly, it gives us every morning we get the report from Scott, and he's able to provide us where their potential was for storms. So we know where storms are coming from. Again, we can't stop them, so there's nothing we can do about it, but at least we can prepare for what type of storm is coming. So it gives us an indication of what happened. Again, not that's some of the stuff we've shared with Scott, is that we provide them our payment data, or our loss data, not payment, but the loss percentage data, to overlay with those maps that they have, so that they can help strengthen their algorithms to say there is hail or there isn't hail. And again, in the map that I showed you where we have overlays, not always is there hail damage to those crops. As Scott said, sometimes a storm lifts, it changes, topography has something to do with that sometimes. But it's been a great help with us in determining, firstly, even if there is hail or a storm or possibility of it when we have claims, because we sometimes get claims where there really isn't any hail. It's other damage or other types of crop damage that come into play. So it's been very helpful for us this year. It was a great test and helped a lot.
Great, thanks, Murray. And one last question here. How large does the hail have to be to cause damage? Maybe Murray can address that.
I think Scott covered it off too. Hail can be small, and with lots of wind, it can cause damage. Stage a crop for us means a lot. Early hail tends to, it may cause severe damage or look like the crop's got severe damage, but the crop has recovery. A, it gets moisture. B, it'll get heat after, those types of things, and can cause recovery. But for us, we go into a field, some of our guys, and they'll see where the big stones fell. But did it actually hit the crop, or what damage does it do? I don't think there's anything we find that changes that severity. And I'll use an example, Alberta as an example. We don't write in Alberta, but I have over my career. And they seed the clouds. And in cloud seeding, what it does is soften the hail or changes it more mushy. It really doesn't, it really doesn't change that the hail came. There's just a lot more of it. So it still provides the same damage, or can be the same damage as the bigger stone would have been, or the rock ice that Scott had shown. So yeah, it really depends. There's not a science to, even Scott's data this year showed us that when it tells us it could be 50 millimeter hail, it's really maybe the damage isn't as bad just because of the stage the crop was at.
Right. Yeah, and also external factors, probably such as wind and other things too, can impact that. So, yeah, that makes sense. And so I'll do the draw for the subscription and the gift bag while you guys answer this last question here. Any plans in the future to expand the database? I assume the Canadian Hail database to other U.S. or other parts of the world. So that would be for Scott.
Sure, I'll answer that. I just realized I forgot the second part of Ahmed's question, which was whether sources can you use apart from radar to detect hail. So I'll just quickly do that. As I mentioned, satellite and lightning detection are two ways. The problem with those is that they don't really tell you much about the exact track or size of the hail. They just kind of tell you where there's a strong storm happening. So they're not nearly as good. They give you a bit of information, especially in areas that don't have radar. So those are two other sources I would look at. And then the question about expanding the database. So we've primarily focused on Canada because Canada does not have a nationwide quality controlled database for hail that's highly accurate and precise. The government does have some hail data, but it follows very widely varying methodologies for collection and varying qualities. And it's also not publicly accessible. So we've introduced our database. It has approximately 4 times more reports than the government over the same time. It also has strict quality control standards that are available to people. So that's why we've done Canada, because it had a void in this area where there wasn't data. So as far as expanding, the US already has a good database, which you can download on the National Weather Service website. We may merge that with ours at some point, but we don't really need to expand on that because they've already done a lot of work around their hail database. The Europeans have a similar database, which also has strict quality control and covers pretty much the whole continent. So those two areas are already well covered. Outside of those regions, other parts of the world get hail too. We just haven't really, I've never had any demand for data in other parts of the world yet. If I do, then maybe we would look to expand to other underserved area, but Canada is where we focus because it's currently very underserved and there's potential to provide a lot of valuable insights with the database we have.
Okay, thanks. And oh, I see Rick just posted a question too. Is there a cost to obtain a subscription from Weatherlogix? Well, Rick, it's your lucky day because you were picked for the subscription
Wow.
gift. So
that's
very lucky. So Rick, congratulations, you won the subscription. And Courtney Clapwick, you got the co-op gift bag. So those are the two winners for the subscriptions and the gift bag, and we'll be in touch with you shortly.
And for those that didn't win, if you're interested, you can purchase subscriptions on our website, and there's also contact, so feel free to send us a message if you want more details. We're happy to talk with you about that.
Weatherlogix.com. All right, so I think that's the end of our webinar today. Thanks everyone for coming and attending. Make sure to watch for other announcements because we'll have other webinars in the future. So check this winter. Well, I'm sure we'll have a couple webinars. Thanks for listening. See you,
Thanks, everyone.